Hello everyone, I'm back with another Marvel Legends action figure review today, and I'm really excited to review this figure because this is the X-Men animated series Cyclops. And why am I so excited about this release in particular? Well, for the longest time I've wanted a Jim Lee version of Cyclops in my 6-inch collection ever since Toy Biz first released one way back. But this release was pretty difficult to get hold of, and to be honest I was never entirely happy with it. The proportions of this Cyclops just seemed a little bit too skinny and the detailing just didn't look quite right. And it was many years before Hasbro would actually take up the challenge of re-releasing a Jim Lee version of Cyclops, which they did a few years ago in their Warlock Bath series. Now, you could be forgiven for thinking that would have closed the book on my hunger to get hold of this figure. However, this figure was notoriously difficult to get hold of, and I never actually managed to secure one until a few years later when he was re-released as part of the Love Triangle 3-pack, in which he sports this fancy bomber jacket, which I thought was actually really cool, and I really like this figure, and for the most part I thought I'm happy to live with this version of the character. But as much as I loved it, there was always something that ever so slightly niggled me, and I wasn't quite sure what it was until this release, which we're going to take a look at today. So without further ado, let's start off by looking at the packaging. As you can see, Hasbro have opted for the plastic-free approach with this packaging. I actually think it worked really well for this series in particular because I really like this nostalgic VHS sort of throwback design, which I think works really well, which is very nostalgic for people like myself who grew up in the 90s who were collecting the old cassette tapes of the X-Men animated series on video, which is really cool. So really love these designs. I love the artwork. It's very reminiscent of the animated series and of that particular time, which is really fun. And I think this is a really striking, colourful image that is mostly text-free, and it looks really good. So love this approach. I think it looks fantastic on display. Likewise, if we put it on its side and we look at the side panel again, we have the head that's facing towards the right there, or the left if you flip it around. Again, it's got that look to as if it was a VHS cassette tape, which is very cool. And of course, these stack up very nicely with the others in the line, so you can put these on your shelf and they look very consistent and really fun. If we flip to the reverse, we can see there's an awful lot of text here. There's a little bit of bio in various different languages about the character, which is absolutely fine. And then we have this digital rendering of the action figure itself. This is an interesting approach. I guess this is what they mock up before they actually put the figure into production, before they have any actual photos of it. So it doesn't look quite real, and it's not quite accurate. But hey, it's a pretty decent representation, and it's nice and colourful, and it looks fine. But all in all, this packaging just feels really text heavy on the back, and it's not the most displayable. It's all about the front of the packaging here. Now then, I'm not going to beat about the bush. I absolutely love this figure, and straight away, as soon as you get him out of the packaging, I think you'll be struck by just how colourful this figure is, and instantly there's something far superior about this release than the previous. So let's look at the head sculpt. If we compare it to the previous release, we can see they've actually made some moderations to this sculpt, not just in terms of the paint apps, but the actual sculpt itself. Particularly if we look at the hair here, we can see obviously those strands of hair coming over his forehead there is ever so slightly different. It's a slightly different style, and of course, it's much brighter. And it's very subtle, but I also think the visor is ever so slightly chunkier as well on this new release. Now, at first glance, you could be forgiven for thinking that this is the same body mold as on the previous release, but actually, looking at it, there's just something a lot more satisfying about this release in terms of the proportions against the previous release, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it until I put these figures next to each other. And it's not just the brightness, of course, I do love the brighter colours here, but it's everything to do with the bandana across his chest. If we zoom in on the torso, we'll see a couple of very key differences. First off, you might notice that utility belt is a brand new sculpt. It actually looks a lot different, especially those pouches. Actually, I would say there's probably a little bit less detail than the previous release. This may bother some, but they're actually taller and they look more natural, more in proportion, more realistic, which I think is really good on this new release. But the key thing here, as I said, is this bandana, because the approach they took with the original release was to have a separate plastic piece that was free from the body. This would compromise articulation and would be a little bit awkward, and as you can see, it's quite chunky. If we look at this new release on the right though, we can see that this has actually been sculpted into the body itself, and it works really well with the articulation. not to mention looking much more in proportion and in correct scale with the body, and a little bit less clunky than the original release. And this is what was fundamentally bugging me about the reissue of this figure. It's only with this release that I've been able to finally put my finger on it, and it is this bandana. This looks so much better on this new animated version of the figure than on this previous release, because that extra plastic piece bandana was really bugging me and I didn't even know it. I also think they've done a much better job when it comes to the hips. They look a lot more subtle, like they sort of naturally fold into his pants there than on the original release, which look a little bit stark by comparison. Obviously, when we put these two figures side by side, we can see there's a huge contrast in the colouring of these releases. Obviously, this new animated version on the left is much brighter, much more colourful, but overall his proportions just look better. They look more natural, much more like he should do, in my opinion. So I really prefer this look overall, and it really puts the original release into the shade. The other thing that really bugged me about the love triangle version of this figure, and indeed obviously the original release as well from Hasbro, was the rubber bands around the legs. We can see obviously on the love triangle version these are extra pieces that are kind of loose, and they do have a tendency to fall down every time you pose him, so you'll be constantly trying to adjust these and fix these, and they look a little bit clunky. They're an extra piece, so they're a little bit thicker, they don't look quite natural, and they've just been slid on there, and it doesn't look great. Likewise, if we look at the bottom of the boots as well, we can see at the top of the boot cut there, again they've done the same thing, just added this plastic piece that constantly wants to fall down, and you're always having to fix it and push it back into place every time you pose it. They fixed that with this new release because these bands are now gone. They're actually built into the sculpt, and it works so much better. They're better in terms of proportion, and there's none of that messing about, which is brilliant. So let's talk articulation. He has a ball joint in the neck, so of course he can spin his head all the way around, and he can look up and down a pretty healthy distance as well. He has ball joints in the shoulders, so those arms kick up and out. You'll notice there is a complementary bicep swivel there as well. Double jointed elbows, so the arm can go all the way back there. And of course there is a pin swivel at the wrist, so that wrist rotates all the way around and it hinges forwards and backwards. There is, however, added articulation at the top of this ball joint in the shoulder, because you'll see there is a butterfly joint here that allows the arm to rotate all the way back and forwards, which is absolutely fantastic. This is much improved on the original release. He has a swivel at the waist, and see how the swivel happens below the pockets, so that looks seamless, which is absolutely brilliant. I love this. He's also got an ab crunch, so of course he can bend forwards and backwards. A pretty good range there, which is fantastic. Ball joints in the hips, so his legs kick out to the side. There's an upper thigh swivel, and then there's also a lower boot swivel as well, which is pretty cool stuff. So the legs kick forwards and they kick backwards. There's double jointed knees, so those lower legs can kick all the way back there, which is fantastic. And then finally, there is a ball joint in the ankle, so of course that foot can hinge forwards and backwards and rotate from side to side. He's fairly light when it comes to accessories. He just comes with an additional 3 hands. There's no extra heads or laser beam effects or anything like that, which would have been really cool. But these extra hands are appreciated. This means he has his optic blast hand, which is absolutely key for this figure, and a couple of open hands there as well. So there's actually a number of different options here, which is quite fun. And ultimately, if you wanted to swap out the head and have a Scott Summers head, you could use the one from the Love Triangle pack if you were lucky enough to get hold of that. So I think this works perfectly fine. And I think overall the improvements to the articulation and just the general sculpt more than make up for the lack of accessories. In terms of scaling, here he is standing next to the animated series version of Wolverine from this sub-series. As you can see, they scale quite nicely together. Obviously he's a lot taller, but as I said, key with this figure is the proportions. I really feel like they've nailed the proportions of the body mold here. This looks really good and very accurate to me. And as I've said many times, I really love this line. It was a line that really won me over, because initially I didn't think I was going to get any of these figures. I thought it was a little bit of a cash in on Hasbro's part, re-releasing figures that had already been released years before and just changing the paint apps, you know, adding a bit of cell shading on these figures. And as you can see with Cyclops, they've pulled back on that a little bit. There is still there in some of his boots, for example, and his banding, but there's a lot less cell shading. So if you're not a fan of this, then I think it's subtle enough for you to really like this figure regardless. And if you are a fan, there's a enough there to justify it. I actually do like the cell shading, so this works really well for me. But yeah, it's a line that's really won me over. I actually really look forward to these releases now, because they are doing little subtle things, like with this Cyclops figure, that are actually improvements on the original release, and I love how bright and colourful they are. So I should get into giving my rating, and for me, you can probably already guessed, it's a 5-star figure for me. I love everything about this Cyclops. This, for me, is probably my definitive Cyclops figure now. It's done everything correct. I love the proportions of him, I love the colours, I love the, you know, the extra hands that we get, and I just think they've really nailed what this character look and feels like at long last. And I just think, for me, this is my favourite version of this character to date. I love the articulation, it's brilliant, there's probably more than you need, and it just works so well, and he looks so dramatic and so cool on display. So if you're a Cyclops fan, as I am, then I can't imagine that you won't love this figure and want to get hold of it. Even if you already have the previous release from Hasbro, you're gonna want this guy. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.